23rd of February, 1945 dawned cold and gray over the volcanic wasteland of Iwo Jima, where hell had taken physical form. The thunderous roar of naval artillery had been hammering the tiny island for 72 consecutive days, the longest pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history. Yet somehow the Japanese defenders remained hidden in their labyrinth of tunnels, waiting like coiled serpents beneath the black sand. Corporal James Whitley of the 5th Marine Division pressed his body against a shell crater's edge, tasting sulfur and death on the wind. 3 days into the assault, and the Americans had learned a terrible truth. Conventional weapons meant nothing against an enemy who fought from underground. The Japanese had transformed Iwo Jima's 8 square miles into a fortress of volcanic rock and reinforced concrete, with 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,600 defensive positions. Artillery shells that would have devastated surface fortifications simply bounced off or buried themselves uselessly in the soft volcanic ash. Then, on this gray morning, Whitley heard something new, a mechanical growling that made the earth itself seem to tremble. Through the acrid smoke drifting across the battlefield, he glimpsed shapes emerging from the landing zone, M4 Sherman tanks, but modified into something that looked like mechanical dragons. These were the Zippo tanks, officially designated as M4A3R8 flamethrower tanks, named after the popular cigarette lighter because, as the Marines grimly joked, they too provided a light in the darkness. First Lieutenant Robert Neiman commanded the lead flamethrower tank, call sign Satan's Breath. His crew had trained for months at Camp Pendleton, learning to operate the specialized equipment that replaced the Sherman's 75mm main gun with a flame projector capable of hurling napalm-thickened fuel oil 150 yards. The modifications were classified top secret until the Iwo Jima operation, and now, as Neiman gave the order to advance, the entire character of the Pacific War was about to change. According to documentation later compiled in the Marine Corps Historical Division's official battle reports, Japanese Lieutenant Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi commanded the tank regiment defending the island's northern sectors. A 1932 Olympic gold medalist in equestrian events, Nishi was beloved by his men and respected even by his American adversaries. But nothing in his cavalry experience, nor in any samurai tradition, had prepared him for what emerged from the morning haze that February day. Private Kazuo Yamada, positioned in a concrete pillbox designated Position 17 on Japanese tactical maps, watched through his firing slit as the strange tanks approached. He had survived the bombardment, conserved his ammunition, and waited with the patience his commanders demanded. His orders were explicit. Hold position, die in place, take 10 Americans with you. The Emperor's divine will required nothing less. What happened next would be reported in the Stars and Stripes newspaper's March 5th edition, and would forever change the mathematics of fortress warfare. As the flamethrower tanks closed within range, their crews made final preparations, checking fuel pressure and ignition systems. The Japanese defenders, confident in their impregnable positions, prepared to unleash the same devastating crossfire that had already killed or wounded thousands of Marines attempting to cross the deadly ground between the beaches and the airfield. But the Americans had brought a new kind of fire to Prometheus's island. The first Zippo tank fired at precisely 0800 hours, and the battlefield transformed into something from medieval visions of perdition. A stream of burning jellied gasoline erupted from Satan's Breath's flame projector, arcing through the air like a liquid comet before splashing against Position 17's firing slit. The napalm mixture, thickened to the consistency of honey, clung to everything it touched and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Private Yamada's world became instant agony. The flame didn't simply enter the pillbox, it consumed the oxygen itself, creating a backdraft that sucked the fire deeper into the fortification. Within seconds, the temperature inside the concrete structure exceeded 400 degrees. Yamada and his 7 companions had 3 choices: burn alive in their bunker, flee into the open where Marine riflemen waited, or succumb to the carbon monoxide that now filled their tomb. Lieutenant Neiman watched through his periscope as Japanese soldiers erupted from hidden positions all along the ridgeline. Some emerged on fire, human torches staggering blindly before collapsing. Others ran for secondary positions, only to be cut down by Marine infantry advancing in the flamethrower tank's wake. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers who had sworn to die in their positions abandoned centuries of military tradition, choosing the slim chance of survival over the certainty of incineration. Sergeant Thomas Red Murphy commanded the second flamethrower tank, nicknamed Dragon's Breath. His target was a reinforced machine gun nest that had pinned down Baker Company for 18 hours, killing 23 Marines and wounding 47 others. The position was carved directly into volcanic rock, with overlapping fields of fire that made any approach suicidal. Previous tank assaults had failed. The armor-piercing rounds simply ricocheted off the basalt, and high-explosive shells lacked the precision to penetrate the narrow firing slits. Murphy maneuvered Dragon's Breath to within 75 yards, close enough to see the machine gun's barrel tracking his advance. The Japanese gunners opened fire, their 7.7mm rounds sparking off the Sherman's frontal armor like angry wasps. Murphy's gunner, Corporal Vincent DeLuca, aligned the flame projector's crosshairs and pressed the firing mechanism. The napalm stream hit the gun port with surgical precision. This technique, later documented in the Marine Corps Gazette's comprehensive study of Iwo Jima tactics published in September 1945, exploited a fundamental vulnerability of static fortifications. They required openings for observation and fire. These same openings became fatal weaknesses against flamethrower attacks. The burning gel splashed through the gun port, coating the interior walls and instantly igniting everything combustible inside. Baron Nishi, observing from his command post in the island's northern highlands, felt something he had never experienced in 20 years of military service: helplessness. His defensive strategy relied on forcing the Americans to attack prepared positions in costly frontal assaults. Japanese doctrine emphasized defense in depth, with each position supporting others in an interlocking web of destruction. But the flamethrower tanks had broken this calculus. They could neutralize prepared positions without exposing infantry to withering crossfire. Captain Samaji Inuye, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 145th Infantry Regiment, sent a desperate radio message to Nishi's headquarters. His encoded transmission, later recovered by American intelligence and translated in War Department records, read simply, "The Americans have brought dragon fire. Our positions are burning. Request orders." Nishi had no orders to give except those already given. Fight to the death. But as he watched section after section of his carefully prepared defenses collapse under the flamethrower assault, he understood that courage alone could not defeat this weapon. The volcanic ash beneath the Marines' boots turned to glass where the burning napalm fell. By mid-afternoon on the 23rd of February, 8 flamethrower tanks had been committed to the assault on what Marines had grimly christened the Meat Grinder, a complex of fortified positions including Hill 382, known as Motoyama to the Japanese, and the surrounding amphitheater of death. This was the strongest sector of Baron Nishi's defensive line, where volcanic geology provided natural fortifications supplemented by months of intensive engineering work. Corporal Michael Antonelli crouched behind a wrecked Amtrak, watching the flamethrower tanks work. A veteran of Tarawa and Saipan, he had seen enough Pacific combat to recognize something unprecedented unfolding before him. The Japanese on previous islands had been fanatical defenders, but their positions eventually yielded to overwhelming firepower and Marine determination. Iwo Jima was different. The island's defenders had created a fortress that swallowed conventional attacks without apparent damage, emerging unscathed to slaughter each successive assault wave. "Those flame tanks are changing everything," Antonelli muttered to Private First Class William Billy Jefferson, a 19-year-old replacement from Tennessee who had landed on D-Day with eyes wide as dinner plates and aged 20 years in 3 days. "We tried taking that ridge for 2 days straight. Lost half the company. Those boys roll up, and the Japs are running in 10 minutes. The 3rd flamethrower tank in the assault column, commanded by Staff Sergeant Harold Wickham, targeted a cave complex that honeycombed the base of Hill 382. Intelligence estimates suggested the caves sheltered between 200 and 300 Japanese soldiers, with multiple entrances connected to the island's tunnel network. Previous attempts to seal or destroy the complex had failed. Demolition teams couldn't approach close enough to place satchel charges, and even direct hits from naval gunfire had merely rearranged the volcanic rock without penetrating to the defenders inside. According to the unit action report filed by Colonel Harry Liversedge, commanding officer of the 28th Marines, documentation now housed in the National Archives, the flamethrower attack on the cave complex began at 1400 hours. Wickham's tank, nicknamed Inferno, approached to within 50 yards of the largest cave entrance before unleashing a sustained burst of napalm that turned the cave mouth into a blast furnace. The physics of the attack were brutally simple. Burning napalm consumed oxygen while generating vast quantities of carbon monoxide and other toxic gases. In enclosed spaces like caves and tunnels, these gases spread rapidly, poisoning everyone inside regardless of how deep they sheltered. Soldiers who survived the initial flames died from asphyxiation or carbon monoxide poisoning. Those who fled deeper into the tunnel network simply carried the toxic gases with them, spreading death throughout the complex. Lieutenant Colonel Nishi received reports of the cave's fall with growing desperation. His defensive strategy was collapsing, not through Marine bravery, which he respected, but through technological superiority, against which samurai spirit provided no defense. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive offense and stoic defense, but offered no tactical solutions for enemies who could burn you out of positions considered impregnable. Private Yamada had somehow survived the initial flamethrower attack on Position 17, escaping through a rear tunnel before the carbon monoxide killed him. He emerged 200 yards from his original position, disoriented and burns covering 30% of his body. Through pain-hazed eyes, he watched another flamethrower tank, systematically destroying the fortifications his unit had spent 4 months constructing. The tank moved with mechanical precision, its commander clearly working from detailed maps showing every defensive position. American intelligence, fed by aerial reconnaissance and signal intercepts, had mapped the Japanese defenses with remarkable accuracy. Each pillbox, each gun pit, each cave entrance had been cataloged and prioritized. The flamethrower tanks worked down this target list with assembly line efficiency. As the sun descended toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across Iwo Jima's tortured landscape, the character of the battle had fundamentally shifted. The Americans were still dying, would continue dying in appalling numbers for another month, but the mathematical certainty of Japanese victory through attrition had evaporated like water on hot volcanic rock. 24th of February brought no respite. If anything, the flamethrower assault intensified as Marine commanders recognized the weapon's devastating effectiveness. Lieutenant General Howland Mad Smith, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, had initially questioned the flamethrower tank's value, according to his post-war memoir published in 1949. The modifications reduced each Sherman's armor-piercing capability and carried only enough fuel for 5 to 7 sustained bursts before requiring dangerous and time-consuming refueling operations. But Smith was a pragmatist who learned quickly. After reviewing the casualty reports from the 23rd, the first day in the campaign where American killed-in-action numbers had actually decreased despite intensified fighting, he ordered every available flamethrower tank committed to the assault. The Zippos would spearhead every major attack, supported by conventional Sherman tanks and infantry and combined arms teams that maximized the flamethrower's strengths while protecting against its vulnerabilities. Baron Nishi understood what these orders meant for his men. From his command post, now relocated twice as American advances threatened each successive position, he composed a final letter to his wife. The letter, recovered after the war and translated for the Marine Corps Historical Center's archives, revealed a man caught between duty and doom. The Americans have brought terrible fire weapons that make our strongest positions into crematoriums. My men fight bravely, but courage cannot extinguish flames that burn underwater and stick to stone. I fear this letter shall be my last. Please tell our children their father died as a samurai, facing the enemy with honor. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison's tank, Hellfire, drew what Marines considered the worst assignment, attacking Bunker Hill, later officially designated as Hill Obo by military cartographers. This volcanic outcrop commanded the entire central sector of the island and sheltered approximately 400 Japanese soldiers in multi-level fortifications with reinforced concrete walls 3 feet thick. Previous attacks had cost the 4th Marine Division 200 casualties without capturing a single yard of ground. Morrison's approach differed from conventional flamethrower tactics. Instead of targeting individual positions, he intended to create a wall of fire that would envelop the entire hillside, denying oxygen to every fortification simultaneously. This technique required coordination among multiple Zippo tanks, timing their fuel bursts to create overlapping fire zones that merged into a single conflagration. At 0730 hours, 4 flamethrower tanks positioned themselves in a semicircle around Bunker Hill's western approach. On Morrison's signal, all 4 fired simultaneously, their napalm streams converging into a tsunami of flame that swept up the hillside like a living thing. The hill's volcanic rock itself seemed to burn as temperatures exceeded 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain Inouye, commanding the bunker complex's defense, felt the heat before he saw the flames. His command bunker, buried 20 feet deep with multiple reinforced layers, should have been invulnerable. But the laws of physics respected neither courage nor concrete. Superheated air traveled through the ventilation system, raising the internal temperature to unbearable levels. The reinforced door, designed to withstand artillery shells, became a griddle that glowed dull red. Japanese soldiers began collapsing from heat exhaustion before the flames ever reached them. The human body cannot survive extended exposure to temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Bunker Hill's fortifications, temperatures reached 300 degrees as the surrounding rock mass absorbed and radiated the fire's heat. Men died not from flames or bullets, but from simple thermodynamics. Their bodies' cooling systems failed, organs shut down, brain function ceased. According to the after-action report filed by Major General Clifton Cates, commanding the 4th Marine Division, Bunker Hill fell at 1100 hours on the 24th of February. The flamethrower assault had neutralized 400 defenders at a cost of 12 American casualties, a casualty ratio unprecedented in Pacific warfighting. The Marines advancing into the captured positions found scenes that would haunt them forever. Japanese soldiers who had died at their posts without visible wounds, killed by heat and poisoned air rather than bullets or flames. Private First Class Jefferson, advancing with the assault wave behind Morrison's tank, stumbled into a command bunker where Captain Inouye and his staff had died sitting at a map table, their fingers still pointing to defensive positions that no longer existed. Their bodies showed no burns, no bullet wounds. They simply looked as though they had fallen asleep while planning the next day's defense. "Jesus Christ," Jefferson whispered, his Tennessee accent thickening with horror. "They just cooked in here like a oven." The volcanic ash continued falling like black snow across the battlefield. 26th of February marked the 5th day of sustained flamethrower operations, and the weapon's impact had rippled beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese radio intercepts, decoded by Navy cryptographers using techniques detailed in the National Security Agency's declassified historical reports from 1995, revealed growing panic among the garrison's surviving commanders. Messages became increasingly desperate, abandoning the stoic tone typical of Japanese military communications. One intercepted transmission from an unknown Japanese officer, later published in the War Department's intelligence summaries, read, "The fire tanks are demons that cannot be stopped. Artillery does not harm them. Our anti-tank guns cannot penetrate before they burn us. Request divine wind to destroy American ships and cut their supply." No divine wind came. Instead, more Zippo tanks landed on Iwo Jima's beaches, their arrival meticulously coordinated by beachmasters who had transformed the bloody invasion site into a functioning logistics hub. By the 26th, 12 flamethrower tanks operated across the island, working in coordinated teams that systematically reduced Japanese strongpoints that had resisted 5 days of conventional assault. Lieutenant Robert Neiman's Satan's breath had survived 4 days of continuous combat, a minor miracle given the flamethrower tank's vulnerability. The fuel system required exposed tanks and pumps that could be ruptured by artillery fragments or sniper fire, transforming the Sherman into a rolling crematorium for its crew. Neiman had lost 2 men on the 24th when a Japanese mortar shell penetrated the engine compartment, igniting fuel lines and forcing an emergency evacuation. Both crewmen had suffered severe burns but survived, evacuated to hospital ships offshore. The Japanese adapted as best they could. Baron Nishi issued orders emphasizing anti-tank tactics specifically targeting the flamethrower vehicles. Japanese soldiers were instructed to aim for the fuel tanks, accept close-range combat where the Zippo's main weapon couldn't depress sufficiently, and employ suicide anti-tank attacks using magnetic mines and pole charges. These tactics achieved some success. 3 flamethrower tanks were destroyed on the 25th alone, but couldn't stem the systematic destruction of Japan's defensive network. Sergeant Thomas Murphy's Dragon's Breath drew assignment to the most dreaded sector on Iwo Jima, the amphitheater, a natural bowl-shaped depression surrounded by volcanic ridges and fortified positions. The Japanese had transformed this geological feature into a kill zone, where intersecting fields of fire could destroy anything that entered. 2 Marine battalions had tried forcing passage through the amphitheater. Both had been shattered, losing over 50% casualties, including most of their officers. Murphy's approach combined the flamethrower's destructive power with patient reconnaissance. Instead of charging directly into the kill zone, he spent hours using his periscope to identify every firing position surrounding the amphitheater's rim. Each machine gun nest, each mortar pit, each sniper hide was marked on a hand-drawn map that grew increasingly detailed as the day progressed. According to the Combat Engineering Assessment published in Military Engineer magazine's July 1945 edition, the amphitheater's defenses incorporated Japanese military engineering at its finest. Positions were mutually supporting, with backup positions prepared for every primary strongpoint. Underground tunnels allowed defenders to reinforce threatened sectors or evacuate casualties without exposure to American fire. The entire complex represented months of labor by experienced combat engineers working with limited resources. At 1500 hours, Murphy radioed for support from conventional Sherman tanks and a company of infantry. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. Use the flamethrower tank to suppress each position in sequence while regular tanks provided covering fire and infantry advanced under the flame's protection. The operation would require perfect timing and coordination, with each element supporting the others in a deadly ballet. Private Yamada, now assigned to a machine gun position on the amphitheater's northern rim after surviving the destruction of Position 17, watched the American preparation with fatalistic certainty. His burns had received minimal treatment, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and infection had set in, leaving him feverish and weak. But his training and indoctrination remained intact. He would die at his post as the Emperor commanded, taking as many Americans with him as possible. Dragon's Breath entered the amphitheater at 15:30 hours. Murphy's first target was a pillbox housing a 47mm anti-tank gun that commanded the entrance. The flamethrower's stream reached across 120 yards, splashing through the gun port with precision born from experience. The pillbox erupted in flames that burned so hot the concrete itself began cracking, explosive spalling sending shrapnel throughout the interior. The anti-tank gun fell silent. Murphy's Sherman advanced 50 yards, then swiveled to engage a machine gun nest on the eastern ridge. The supporting tanks kept up steady fire, their 75mm high-explosive shells suppressing Japanese positions, while the infantry advanced by fire and movement, using every shell crater and rock outcrop for cover. Private Yamada's position came under attack at 1600 hours. He saw the flame tank's turret rotating toward him, saw the barrel of the flame projector aligning. In that final moment, he thought of his family in Hokkaido, wondered if they would ever learn how he died. Then the world became fire. 1st of March arrived with typhoon winds that grounded aircraft and reduced naval gunfire support to ineffective harassment. The weather should have granted Japanese defenders a reprieve, but the flamethrower tanks required no air support or naval artillery to function. If anything, the reduced visibility aided their approach, allowing the Shermans to close with enemy positions before defenders could effectively respond. Corporal Michael Antonelli had been assigned to protect a Zippo tank during refueling operations, the most vulnerable moment in the weapon's operational cycle. Each tank carried approximately 290 gallons of napalm fuel, sufficient for roughly 7 sustained bursts lasting 2 to 3 seconds each. Refueling required combat engineers to approach the tank under fire, connect fuel hoses to exposed fittings, and pump volatile jellied gasoline, while Japanese snipers and mortars sought to transform the operation into a holocaust. "This is the stupidest job in the whole damn Corps," Antonelli muttered, scanning the ridgeline through his rifle's sights while engineers worked frantically to complete the fuel transfer. "If a single bullet hits that fuel line, we're all going home in coffee cans." The Stars and Stripes newspaper's March 8th edition carried a story about the flamethrower tank's success, but carefully omitted details about their vulnerability and operational limitations. Correspondents were forbidden from mentioning refueling procedures, fuel capacity, or the tank's inability to engage targets above certain elevation angles, information that might help Japanese forces develop effective countermeasures. Lieutenant Colonel Nishi had received Imperial General Headquarters' final communication on the 28th of February. The message, recovered post-war from Japanese archives and cited in the Defense Department's official history, ordered him to conduct a final banzai charge, expending his remaining forces in one glorious death ride that would inflict maximum casualties on the Americans. Nishi had quietly ignored these orders. His men would die, that was inevitable, but they would die effectively, selling their lives at the highest possible price rather than squandering them in suicidal theatrics. The Baron focused his remaining forces on anti-tank operations, particularly targeting the hated flamethrower vehicles. Japanese soldiers armed with magnetic mines and pole charges infiltrated American lines at night, seeking opportunities to destroy the Zippos during maintenance or refueling. These attacks achieved sporadic success. 2 more flamethrower tanks were destroyed on the 1st of March, their crews killed in fiery explosions that lit up the night. Staff Sergeant Harold Wickham's Inferno received orders to support the assault on what Marines had designated Turkey Knob, another volcanic outcrop fortified into a strong point that anchored Japanese defenses in the northern sector. The position had resisted 4 days of sustained attack. Its garrison of 250 soldiers dug into tunnels that extended 70 feet below ground level. Wickham's approach to Turkey Knob demonstrated how 4 days of flamethrower operations had refined American tactics. Rather than attempting to burn out the entire position, impossible given the deep tunnel system, he focused on sealing the entrances and ventilation shafts with sustained napalm fire. Burning jellied gasoline would flow into the tunnels like liquid death, consuming oxygen and producing toxic gases that would penetrate to the deepest chambers. The attack commenced at 0800 hours on March 1st. Inferno systematically engaged each known entrance and airshaft, pumping napalm into the underground complex with methodical precision. Combat engineers followed behind, using explosives to collapse tunnel entrances and trap the burning fuel inside. The operation continued throughout the morning, with Wickham refueling twice to maintain pressure on the defenders. By noon, Japanese soldiers began emerging from concealed escape tunnels, preferring surrender or death in the open to slow asphyxiation underground. This was unprecedented. Japanese forces on previous islands had fought to the last man without considering surrender. The flamethrower's psychological impact had finally broken the garrison's collective will to resist. Captain Samaji Inuye, still commanding what remained of his battalion, watched Turkey Knob's fall from an observation post half a mile distant. He had 300 men left from the 1,000 who began the battle. His orders were to defend to the death, but defense meant watching his command burn piecemeal while accomplishing nothing beyond adding their ashes to Iwo Jima's volcanic soil. According to the Marine Corps Historical Division's analysis, published in their comprehensive study, The Flamethrower in the Pacific War, in 1947, the weapon's psychological impact often exceeded its physical destructiveness. Japanese soldiers who had fearlessly faced artillery, naval gunfire, and frontal infantry assault broke when confronted with flamethrower tanks. The weapon violated fundamental human instincts for survival, creating terror that transcended training and indoctrination. Private Billy Jefferson had stopped counting the burned Japanese bodies he encountered. The first few had haunted him, their charred forms frozen in final agonies that no training could prepare a 19-year-old farm boy to witness. But by the fifth day, they had become simply objects, obstacles to step around while advancing toward the next objective. "I don't know if we're Marines anymore," Jefferson confessed to Antonelli during a rare moment of relative safety. "Maybe we're something else now, something the Corps invented because nothing human could do this job." Antonelli had no answer because he suspected Jefferson was right. 8th of March brought tactical changes that would define the battle's final phase. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the V Amphibious Corps ground forces, issued new operational orders emphasizing flamethrower-led combined arms assaults. Every major attack would be spearheaded by at least 2 Zippo tanks, supported by conventional armor, artillery, and infantry, in coordinated formations, designed to maximize the flame weapon's effectiveness while minimizing exposure to Japanese anti-tank fire. These tactics were detailed in classified after-action reports that wouldn't be declassified until 1993, when the National Archives released thousands of pages of Iwo Jima battle documentation. The reports revealed that flamethrower tanks had reduced American casualties by approximately 30 to 40% in sectors where they operated, while increasing the rate of Japanese position capture by similar margins. The weapon hadn't made Iwo Jima easy. Nothing could do that. But it had made victory mathematically certain rather than merely probable. Lieutenant Robert Neiman's Satan's Breath had survived 8 days of combat, a longevity that made it legendary among the flamethrower tank crews. Neiman's skill and caution had kept his crew alive while systematically destroying dozens of Japanese positions. On the 8th of March, he received orders to support the final assault on Baron Nishi's headquarters complex, hidden in caves near Iwo Jima's northern coast. Intelligence reports indicated Nishi commanded approximately 300 soldiers, the last cohesive unit remaining of his original tank regiment, and attached infantry forces. The Baron had fought a masterful defensive campaign, extracting maximum casualties for every yard of ground conceded, but his position was now hopeless. American forces controlled 90% of the island, including both airfields. Japanese resistance had fragmented into isolated pockets that would be systematically reduced over coming days. Neiman approached the caves with extreme caution. This was no typical fortification, but the command post of a brilliant tactician who understood American methods and would have prepared accordingly. Intelligence warned of extensive mining, interconnected tunnels with multiple escape routes, and probable suicide squads armed with anti-tank weapons, willing to trade their lives to destroy a single Sherman. According to the Marine Corps Gazette's detailed tactical analysis published in November 1945, the assault on Nishi's headquarters exemplified mature flamethrower doctrine. Neiman coordinated with infantry, combat engineers, and conventional tanks to create a methodical, deliberate attack that prioritized crew survival over speed. Every suspected tunnel entrance was investigated by infantry before the flamethrower tank approached. Engineers swept for mines and booby traps. Supporting Shermans provided overwatch, ready to suppress any defensive fire. Baron Nishi watched these preparations through a periscope, cunningly concealed among volcanic rocks. He recognized the professionalism in the American approach, appreciated the tactical sophistication that had transformed the initially clumsy marine assaults into refined combined arms operations. The Americans learned quickly. That was their greatest strength. Japanese forces also learned but lacked the resources to implement improved tactics. Learning was useless when you had no fuel, no ammunition, no reinforcements, and no hope. The Baron had already decided his ending. When Satan's Breath reached his headquarters cave, he would lead his remaining men in a final charge, dying as samurai tradition demanded. It was theater, meaningless in military terms, but meaning mattered when nothing else remained. His men deserved better than burning alive like rats in a flooded warren. At 1300 hours, Neiman's tank reached firing position 75 yards from the main cave entrance. He could see Japanese soldiers moving inside, shadows against deeper darkness. The moment had come for another application of the terrible calculus that had defined Iwo Jima. American technology versus Japanese courage, machinery versus spirit, the modern industrial state versus warrior tradition. Private Yamada was already dead, killed during the defense of the amphitheater when Dragon's breath had burned his position. His body lay unburied among thousands of others scattered across Iwo Jima's volcanic landscape, indistinguishable in death from American dead, who had also fallen to the island's inexhaustible hunger for young men's lives. Captain Inouye had died on March 3rd, leading a night attack against American artillery positions in a desperate attempt to reduce the constant bombardment. He and 47 men had penetrated American lines, destroyed 2 howitzers, and killed 16 Marines before being annihilated by converging machine gun fire. His body was never identified, mixed with others in a mass grave marked only by a crude wooden stake with "Unknown Japanese Soldiers" painted in English. Baron Nishi emerged from the cave at 13:15 hours, sword drawn, leading 30 soldiers in a final charge directly at Satan's breath. They ran screaming across the 75 yards of open ground, some firing weapons, others simply running because running was better than waiting for the flames. Neiman never fired. The supporting Sherman tanks and infantry cut down the charge in seconds, precise rifle fire and machine gun bursts ending each life with professional efficiency. The Baron fell 10 yards from Satan's breath, 3 bullets in his chest, his sword still clutched in his right hand. Lieutenant Neiman would later testify that he never saw the Baron's face, never knew he had killed an Olympic champion and nobleman. They were all just enemy soldiers, all just targets, all just names that wouldn't appear in American casualty reports because they had worn the wrong uniform in a war that cared nothing for individuals. 26th of March 1945 marked the official end of organized resistance on Iwo Jima, though isolated Japanese soldiers would continue emerging from caves for weeks, some surrendering, most dying in small skirmishes that seemed pointless after the main battle had concluded. The American flag flew over Mount Suribachi. The iconic photograph had been taken on February 23rd, immortalizing a moment that would define Marine Corps identity for generations. The final accounting was brutal. American forces suffered 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed in action, making Iwo Jima the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Japanese casualties exceeded 21,000, with only 216 prisoners taken, a 98.8% fatality rate that testified to the ferocious desperation of the defense and the devastating effectiveness of American firepower, particularly the flamethrower tanks. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison's Hellfire had survived the entire campaign, one of only 3 flamethrower tanks to operate from the first day to the last without catastrophic damage. Morrison would later write in his memoir, published in 1952, that he never felt pride in his accomplishments on Iwo Jima, only relief at surviving and sorrow for the men, American and Japanese, who hadn't. "We used fire like a tool," he wrote, "but fire doesn't discriminate between evil and courage. It just burns everything it touches." The Marine Corps conducted extensive analysis of flamethrower tank operations, producing classified reports that would influence American military doctrine for decades. These reports, particularly the comprehensive study completed by the Marine Corps Equipment Board in July 1945, concluded that the Zippo tanks had been tactically decisive in reducing fortified positions that would have otherwise required weeks of costly fighting to capture. The weapon's psychological impact had proven as important as its physical destructiveness, breaking Japanese morale in ways conventional weapons couldn't achieve. However, the same reports noted troubling ethical concerns that would resurface during later conflicts. The flamethrower's effectiveness derived partly from its capacity to inflict horrible suffering. Burn victims who survived, and remarkably some did, faced months or years of agonizing recovery from injuries that conventional weapons rarely inflicted. The weapon operated in a moral gray zone between legitimate military necessity and unnecessary cruelty that made even hardened warriors uncomfortable. According to documents housed in the National Archives Pacific War Records section, Army Chemical Warfare Service officers debated whether flamethrower tanks violated the spirit, if not the letter, of international laws governing warfare. These debates remained classified for decades, surfacing only when historians researched declassified materials in the 1980s and 90s. The consensus ultimately held that flamethrowers, however brutal, remained legal weapons when used against legitimate military targets, though their use against civilian populations would constitute war crimes. Corporal Michael Antonelli received the Silver Star for his actions protecting refueling operations under fire, actions that enabled flamethrower tanks to maintain pressure on Japanese defenses during critical phases of the battle. He would later donate the medal to his grandson, who displayed it in a shadow box without truly understanding what his grandfather had witnessed in earning it. Antonelli rarely spoke of Iwo Jima, and never spoke of the burning men he had seen emerging from caves and pillboxes like souls escaping hell itself. Private First Class Billy Jefferson returned to Tennessee after the war, married his high school sweetheart, and farmed tobacco for 40 years without once mentioning to his children that he had fought on Iwo Jima. The nightmares gradually faded, or perhaps he simply learned to function despite them, but he never again attended church. He couldn't reconcile the Christianity of his Tennessee childhood with the things he had witnessed and done on a volcanic island halfway around the world. The flamethrower tank's success on Iwo Jima influenced American planning for the invasion of Japan's home islands, Operation Downfall, scheduled for November 1945. Military planners projected that Japan's mountainous terrain and fanatically defended coastal fortifications would make Iwo Jima's horrors seem modest by comparison. Hundreds of flamethrower tanks were being prepared, along with thousands of portable flamethrowers for infantry, anticipating battles that would dwarf anything yet experienced in the Pacific War. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 rendered these plans unnecessary. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, and the flamethrower tanks that had proven so devastatingly effective on Iwo Jima would never burn Japanese civilians from their homes or soldiers from their defensive positions on the home islands. Whether this represented mercy or merely a different form of horror remains debated by historians to this day. Lieutenant Robert Neiman was promoted to captain and received the Navy Cross for his actions commanding Satan's Breath throughout the Iwo Jima campaign. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and tactical brilliance in employing innovative weapon systems against determined enemy resistance. It made no mention of the hundreds of men his tank had burned alive, because such details seemed inappropriate for official commendations. Neiman would later become a vocal advocate for nuclear weapons, arguing that anything was preferable to the close-quarters horror of flame warfare he had experienced. Baron Takeshi Nishi's body was eventually identified through personal effects and given burial with military honors after the war. His Olympic achievements and noble lineage made him a figure of tragic respect, even among former enemies. American occupation authorities in Japan used his story as propaganda, portraying him as a sophisticated, Western-educated officer who had been forced by militaristic superiors into a hopeless situation. This narrative was partially true, but conveniently omitted Nishi's genuine commitment to Japanese imperial ideology and his skillful defense that had cost thousands of American lives. The tactical lessons from Iwo Jima's flamethrower operations influenced American military doctrine well beyond World War II. During the Korean War, flamethrower tanks again proved effective against fortified positions in mountainous terrain. In Vietnam, they were used with mixed success in jungle warfare, their effectiveness diminished by terrain that didn't favor armored operations. By the 1970s, evolving international humanitarian law and changing American public attitudes toward warfare led to the flamethrowers' gradual retirement from U.S. military arsenals. According to research published in the Journal of Military History's Spring 2003 edition, modern militaries continue studying Iwo Jima's flamethrower operations for insights into urban warfare and fighting in dense terrain where defenders hold advantages. The tactical principles, combining specialized weapons with supporting arms, maintaining operational tempo, exploiting enemy psychological vulnerabilities, remain relevant even as specific weapons systems evolve. The ethical questions about weapons that cause extraordinary suffering also persist, now applied to modern thermobaric weapons and white phosphorus munitions that serve similar tactical roles without technically being flamethrowers. Sergeant Thomas Murphy's Dragon's Breath was eventually returned to the United States and placed on display at Camp Pendleton's Marine Corps Museum, where it remains today. The placard describes its combat record in sanitized language. Destroyed 37 enemy fortifications, supported 12 major assaults, operated continuously for 23 days. It doesn't mention the men who screamed inside those fortifications, or the crew members who spent decades trying to forget the smell of burning human flesh that permeated their tank. Staff Sergeant Harold Wickham's Inferno was less fortunate. Struck by Japanese artillery on March 24th during mop-up operations, it burned completely, its fuel tanks igniting in an explosion that killed 2 crew members and wounded 3 others. The wreckage was bulldozed into a mass grave along with destroyed American and Japanese equipment, buried under Iwo Jima's volcanic ash where it remains today, slowly corroding into rust and memories. The island itself was returned to Japanese control in 1968, though the United States retained limited access rights. Today, Iwo Jima, officially renamed Iwo-to by the Japanese government in 2007, remains largely uninhabited except for Japanese Self-Defense Force personnel manning a small base. The island is not open to general tourism, though annual ceremonies commemorate both American and Japanese dead. Beneath the rebuilt runways and memorial stones, the caves and tunnels remain, many unexplored since 1945. Occasionally, Japanese authorities discover remains of soldiers who died in the darkness, sometimes still at their posts with weapons at hand. These discoveries make news in Japan, brief reminders that the past isn't truly past, merely buried beneath layers of volcanic ash and accumulated decades. In 2005, a joint American-Japanese archaeological team was permitted limited access to several cave complexes that hadn't been opened since the battle. They discovered intact defensive positions, personal effects, and the remains of 11 Japanese soldiers who had died without apparent wounds, likely from carbon monoxide poisoning during a flamethrower attack. The discovery prompted renewed debate in Japan about the ethics of American tactics and the suffering endured by the garrison. The flamethrower tank's success on Iwo Jima represented a turning point in military technology's relationship with human courage. Japanese soldiers had proven that fortifications manned by determined defenders could resist nearly any conventional assault. That courage and preparation could overcome apparently overwhelming material disadvantages. The flamethrower tanks demonstrated that technological innovation could defeat even the most determined resistance, that some weapons simply couldn't be resisted through courage alone. This lesson would echo through subsequent decades of warfare. In Vietnam, American technological superiority couldn't overcome determined resistance fighting on familiar terrain with popular support. In Afghanistan and Iraq, precision weapons and overwhelming firepower couldn't quickly defeat insurgencies willing to accept enormous casualties. The flamethrower tank's success on Iwo Jima represented both the pinnacle and the limitation of technological solutions to military problems. Devastatingly effective in specific circumstances, but not a universal answer to warfare's fundamental challenges. The men who operated those tanks, who lived with memories of what they had done and witnessed, carried burdens that medals and commendations could never fully acknowledge. Some, like Neiman and Morrison, processed their experiences through writing and public service. Others, like Antonelli and Jefferson, buried their memories as deeply as the unnamed dead beneath Iwo Jima's volcanic soil, living quiet lives that never fully escaped the shadows of that terrible spring in 1945. The final casualty figures tell part of the story. 6,821 Americans killed, 19,217 wounded, 21,844 Japanese killed, 216 captured. But numbers cannot capture the human dimension. The young men on both sides who died in fire and darkness, the survivors who carried physical and psychological scars for decades, the families who received telegrams or waited in vain for loved ones who would never return. The flamethrower tanks had proven their tactical value beyond question. Whether their use represented military necessity or crossed ethical boundaries that should have remained inviolate is a question each generation must answer for itself. The Marines who operated them did their duty as they understood it, employing the weapons their nation provided against an enemy they had been trained to defeat. That they succeeded is historical fact. Whether they should have succeeded in precisely that manner remains eternally debatable. Iwo Jima's volcanic ash continues to blow across the island, covering and uncovering the landscape in endless cycles, burying evidence of battle only to expose it again when the wind shifts. The past remains present there in ways it does elsewhere. physical reminder that some places become permanent memorials simply through the accumulation of sacrifice and suffering they have witnessed. The flamethrower tanks are gone now. Museum pieces are scrap metal, their practical utility superseded by newer weapon systems. But their legacy persists in military doctrine, in ethical debates about warfare's conduct, and in the memories, fading now as the last veterans pass, of men who witnessed technology's capacity to make warfare simultaneously more efficient and more terrible, who learned that some victories are achieved at costs that cannot be measured solely in casualties and captured ground. The sun sets over Iwo Jima each evening as it has for millions of years, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. The volcanic rock that witnessed so much death in 1945 simply endures, silent testimony to battles that once seemed to determine the world's fate, but now survive primarily in histories and memories. Lessons for generations who never experienced warfare's reality, but must somehow understand its necessity and its horror, its courage and its cruelty, its technological innovation and its human cost.